My name is Thom, and I am the guest curator for the exhibition Takao Tanabe, Printmaker at the Kelowna Art Gallery. This is actually the first exhibition of the of Takao Tanabe's work as a printmaker, and that's partially because Mr. Tanabe always wanted there to be a special exhibition of his prints, and so he resisted putting prints in other exhibitions. And it is an exhibition which looks at 75 years of his printmaking. His printmaking begins in 1948 when he was a student at the Winnipeg School of Art, and it continues up to a print he made this year in 2023. It is arranged fundamentally chronologically, and he explored a whole variety of printmaking techniques, from lino cuts to etching and aquatint, as you see in this print here, which is a print from 1951 called Trees and Sky. He then, after he got the Emily Carr Scholarship and went to London and studied there, he did his whole series of lithographs at the Central St. Martin's School of Art, or the Central School of Art in London, sorry. And then he came back to Canada in the middle of the 1950s, and he began to do a number of prints, such as these monotypes that are here. But his printmaking was always sort of done in tandem with his painting career. In the early part of Tanabe's career, he regarded himself fundamentally as being an abstract painter. And in fact, even into the 1970s, if you asked him, are you a landscape artist or a landscape artist, he'd say he was an abstract painter. And he's always threatens to return to abstract painting, even now in his 90s, but mostly it's been landscape painting. However, in the early years of his career, he of course was not in a position to use the collaborators to do printmaking with him, because he basically didn't have the money to do it. So most of the early prints are all printed by he himself. And a number of our early things include a wonderful series of screen prints that he did in the 1960s. And the most famous of these are a series of prints that are mounted here in the center of the wall called cut corners. And these are all prints that Mr. Tanabe screen printed himself. And they indeed do have, if you look carefully, every one of them has a cut corner, like this one's here. This one has a cut corner out here and a cut corner there. And why this is a really interesting thing to have happen is that basically what the cut corner of the piece of paper turns this work into, it turns the print itself into an object rather than the piece of paper as something holding an image rather than an object. And I asked him why he did this, and he said, well, sometimes you come up with strange ideas. But it's completely unheard of, this approach to screen print making in Canada in the 1960s. And he even did a whole series, that arranged as diamond shapes, like kites, in fact, like sort of objects which might make some bit of sort of connection back to his Japanese ancestry. Although Mr. Tanabe is of Japanese-Canadian ancestry, he was born in Canada in 1926 in a place called Seal Cove, which is now part of Prince Rupert in British Columbia. He, of course, looks Japanese. And this, of course, became a major problem for him in the 1940s when the Canadian government decided to move all these Japanese Canadians away from the coast because they were afraid they were going to help the Japanese war effort. And this had a huge impact on Tanabe and a number of other people. A lot of people lost their livelihoods and so on. But Tanabe's case, he was only 13 years old when he was sent to an internment camp in Lemon Creek in interior British Columbia. So his education completely stopped. There were no schools. I mean, the Japanese Canadians who were moved to Lemon Creek basically had to build their own houses. Cut down the trees and build the houses and all that stuff. And he was able to stay there. He stayed there for a couple of years. And then some of his siblings were in Winnipeg. And you were allowed to move away from the coast, but you were never allowed to move back to the coast. So he moved to Winnipeg in 1944. And at that point in his life, he literally had no idea that you could be an artist. He had no conception that a fine artist existed. And he certainly didn't know about making prints, and he didn't know about any approach to making art. And in Winnipeg, he did a bunch of odd jobs around the city, but he then realized, you know, he didn't really want to do manual labor for the rest of his life. And someone told him that you could actually get admission to the art school without having graduated from high school. And so he applied, and he entered the art school in 1946. And luckily for him, shortly after his entrance into the Winnipeg School of Art, the school had been a new painting teacher arrived, a man named Joseph Plaskett, the artist Joseph Plaskett, who'd just come back from doing training in New York City, and he introduced Tak to the idea that you could be a fine artist, because he'd initially enrolled in this Winnipeg School of Art because of the idea to be a sign painter. I mean, he had no idea that there were art galleries. He had no idea that there were paintings you could do, and because there was no art exposure in his childhood. But he actually made his first prints at the Winnipeg School of Art. They're both included in this exhibition. They were Christmas cards, in fact, that he made to send to people he thought, you know, he should be nice to, I suppose. Printmaking took off from there. So throughout his career, he's done a total of 94 prints. And they, as I said earlier, they range from 1948 to 2023. And in fact, the print from 2023 called Cormorant Island has been purchased by the Cologne Art Gallery for their permanent collection. So that will be included in this showing. But after he did these wonderful screen prints, he basically was still making abstract art. And then in 1968, he moved himself to the United States because his first wife wanted to do graduate studies at Bryn Mawr, which is outside of Philadelphia, and we went with her to the United States. In those days, it was much easier to cross the border than it is now. But he soon realized that Philadelphia was kind of boring, and so he moved to New York City, and he was in New York City for the next several years. Trying to make his way as an artist, because New York was the place to be an artist in North America. And he met people like, Ad Reinhardt and a number of other major abstract artists. And he did a lot of work helping artists alter their lofts so that they could live in them. But the important thing that happened to him in New York was that he had arranged an ongoing relationship with the gallerist Mira Godard, who at that time had a gallery in Montreal. And in 1972, she actually agreed to give him a regular stipend. So it's $300 a month. And so he would paint paintings in New York and send her all the paintings to New York. And at the end, if she sold enough paintings to cover the stipend, she owed him money. But if she didn't sell enough paintings, he owed her money. But that tiny amount of money allowed him to persist in New York City. But that being said, he eventually realized that he was not going to be able to maintain himself there. But he established a number of relationships with printmakers, and he did prints such as this one in New York. His wife got a job in Halifax, and he originally thought he might go to Halifax, but then he also realized Halifax wasn't the place for him. And as it so happened, in the summer of 1972, he was offered a job running the Banff School of Fine Arts for the summer. In those days, it was really just basically a summer school. It didn't have a winter program or anything like this. And it went very well, and he enjoyed it. And they then decided they would offer him a job in the winter, and all the way through the year round. So he'd encourage students to come and sort of professionalize the program. And he was supposed to start in 1973. And he signed a contract, and he was all set to go. Well, in 1972, when he had gone out to Banff, he was so broke that he hitchhiked across the entire of the Canadian prairies. And he was very, very struck by the immense skies and so on. And he thought he would begin to make work related to that subject matter. Well, it turned out in the summer, in sort of the early fall of 1973, he had an extremely successful show at Guest Gallery in Montreal. This was before she'd opened a gallery in Toronto. And he tried to get out of the contract in Banff because he decided he was making enough money. But the people in Banff said, no, you've signed a contract, you're going to come. And that was an important turning point in his career because although he didn't do a lot of teaching, he fundamentally changed the art school at Banff. And one of the conditions on which he went to Banff was that he was given his own studio. He would only be able to use it, and he would be able to do what he wanted to do. Well, as I said, in '72 he'd been completely struck by the prairie landscape. And so he began to produce paintings and prints, such as you see here, of that landscape. So although he's living in this glorious mountain scenery, he's not doing any work of that. He's painting these things. And the other thing that happened was that the big shift that occurred in his looking at the prairies is he began to take photographs, and he would use photographs as the basis of the work. But when you look at prints such as these ones, what you notice is something quite striking, which becomes a characteristic of all his landscape prints, and with the exception of the very earliest one, which you'll see an image of later. This is the prairie, and there's a very big emphasis sky, and he was also painting large acrylic paintings at the same time. And so these are two lithographs which he worked with collaborators on to create this. But you notice there are no houses, there's no power poles, there's no trace of humanity at all in these pictures. So in fact, they're almost abstractions of the landscape, and that really fundamentally changed the way the prairies was painted. And in fact, it was so striking, this shift in the way the prairies were being depicted, but in both his prints and his paintings, that even though he only started painting these paintings in 1972, in 1976 he had a touring show that went across Canada of these new paintings of the prairies. Now, in a lot of cases, what you see is the prints that you see here do relate to paintings, but there's usually ever so slight differences. But the other thing that's interesting about Tanabe is he's constantly sort of manipulating the language of the printmaking form, in this case lithography. Well, here's a perfect example of it. This is a print which is called Prairie Storm. And it has an interesting date. It starts in 1970. This is where when you get old like me, you can barely see. 1970, he printed the lower section you see here from a plate, but it was a 2-plate print, and the sky print completely failed. So he had all these sheets of paper that had this bottom part stuck on it, and he didn't know what to do with it. But it was basically, there was nothing up here. Well, in 2003, he decided what he was going to do is he would rescue this body of work, these lithographs, these partially successful lithographs, and he painted acrylic washes over the tops of the thing, and that happened in 2003, which is why the date is 1970/2003. This is the only time he ever did this, but he was so determined to make this print work that you see the results. So in fact, there's an edition of 50, but they're all ever so slightly different because each of them are hand painted. Now, I mean, he would vary texture, as you see here in this trial proof called Prairie Morning, which is you get texture in the sky. And then he also began in the later 70s to produce images such as this one of this massif in the Rockies, which you can just barely detect here. And then there's a very, very dark sky. Now, he was in Banff running the school from 1973 to 1980 when he finally decided to leave, and he returned to his native British Columbia. He'd had 1 year of sabbatical in 1977. But he felt he'd done what he was able to do. And if you look at the school in Banff, before he was there and after he left, he started the Walter Phillips Gallery in Banff. so that students would have a place to actually show their work. He made a rule that no teacher could teach more than twice there, so they'd have teachers. And he convinced artists from all across Canada to come and teach students in Banff. So it's really become a professional place. So you could really go there and sort of work your way towards having a professional program of study at one of the universities. But he continues to produce these sort of prairie pictures. And the other thing that and this continues in this space, and the other thing that happens is that in the early 1980s, he meets a man by the name of Masato Arakushi. And Masato Arakushi was originally working with the Japanese printmaker Nobu Sawai in Vancouver at his studio. And Masato is part of what's called the mokuhanga tradition. And in traditional Japanese printmaking, you have an artist that does the design, makes the composition. You have someone who carves the block, and then you have someone else who prints the print. Now, in the case of mokuhanga, you have Mr. Tanabe who would make the design, and in this case, he would paint an acrylic painting. And then Masato Arakushi would take that painting, figure out how it should work as blocks, and then carve the blocks, and then print the blocks. And these are two early woodblock prints. And so every color that you see here is a different block. Now the other thing that happens in mokuhanga is that there's virtually no use of line. Whereas traditional Japanese prints, have ukiyo-e prints have those black outlines. They don't appear here. And the other thing that's interesting about these is that the printer, in this case Masato Arakushi, he also, not only does he carve the block, he applies the ink, he sort of then prints the print, and in an image like this, which is on a Japanese paper called kozu, it has to be kept wet through the entire process of printing the print. So if it takes 2 days to print the print, every piece of paper has to be kept wet. And of course, the final print, you don't know if it succeeded or not until you've printed every single block. And one of the other things that happens in these prints is, in a lot of cases, there's ink printed over other layers of ink. So it's a very, very difficult process to print and very exacting. And I mean, you take an image such as this one on the road to Banff, there's this tiny, tiny little image of the mountains in the distance. Extremely difficult to print. But Tanabe liked the process, and then when Masato Arakushi left Nobu Sawai's atelier, Tanabe decided he would employ Masato Arakushi to produce a series of prints. And by this time, of course, he's moved to British Columbia, and he turns his attention in prints. And he's making both lithographs of BC, and he's also making wood blocks of British Columbia here, as you see here. And one of the things that you do in a wood block is you will often use the texture of the block to provide texture within the print. And if you look at this one carefully, there's a bunch of sort of surface texture that occurs, but it's worth paying a lot of attention to this, because the delicacy of the printing of the clouds, for example, or the little hillsides in the background is really quite extraordinary. And I mean, it takes a real artist to be able to create an image like this. He also produced some very large screen prints, and in this case of landscape, and you see one of these here. And of course, each color is a different screen. Now, Tanabe produced a total of 13 prints in woodblock, 10 of which are of British Columbia. And all of those prints of BC are here in this next section of the show. And it's a truly extraordinary group of images. And one of the things that I wanted to do in the exhibition was to show a set of blocks for one of the prints, in this case a print called Nootka Afternoon. Now there is a painting that Tanabe did of Nootka Afternoon, but the painting and the print are ever so slightly differently. And so all of the 6 blocks that you see here had to be printed in various different efforts. And this block is really interesting because it gets printed 3 separate times. You can't print all the sections together. So this little tiny little bit of hillside here is actually way back here in the background, and it's one of the earliest pieces of it. And the black hillside here is in fact this image printed once, this image printed once, the sky is this image, and then in front of, after those two have been printed, this image gets printed here in the foreground. And the water is printed with that image of blue, that image of blue, that image of blue, that image of blue, and finally the image of pink. So it's a fairly complicated process. And as I say, the piece of paper has to remain wet. Now if you look carefully at these blocks, you will see, and most of them have a little indentation in the corner, and some place in the corner, and that's where the paper got shoved on the blocks to be positioned so it could be lined up correctly. And these are all printed by hand. I mean, you don't use a printing press or anything like this. You basically take the piece of paper, you lie it down, and then you rub it with a baron from the back. And so obviously there's lots of accidents that occur because if you make it ever so slightly off, I mean, the print doesn't work. So it's a really amazing group of images that Mr. Tanabe produced of BC. And like I say, most of them relate to prints. And he will also do some interesting things. So for example, these 2 prints of Raza Pass use exactly the same blocks, but the inking is different. Now this print, which is called Dawn Malacca Straight, or it's Malacca Straight Dawn, my apologies, is the biggest print he ever made, and it's almost it's more than a meter wide, and it's also one of the most complicated prints. And in this case, it was a print he made with the printer Peter Braun, who runs a company called New Leaf Editions in Vancouver. But the plate was so big that he couldn't print it at his printing shop, and so he had to have it printed at the Capilano University's printing shop. Now the other thing that's interesting about this print is a very unusual thing which has etching, aquatint, and a woodblock. So the lower section is an entire. There's only 15 of them because it was so difficult to print that, in fact, I mean, I think basically Peter Braun said enough. But it's based on a painting that's in a private collection in Vancouver. But it's very, very different than the painting. And this is true of many of these things. Although there are paintings that look like this, they're not an exact replica. So, for example, the sky in this one is much, much different color. It's a very different, much more pink than it is. But there's also an interesting connection with Kelowna in this exhibition, because there's this group of 3 prints, all of which are, that one's called Bright Sky, but these are 2 untitled prints, were made at UBC Okanagan in 2010. So these were actually made during the course of one day at UBC Okanagan with a woman named Ms. Widmer, who the printer was under the aegis of Gary Pearson. And so Tack arrived at UBC Okanagan with a series of pieces of paper, a mat board, which are these sort of strips and these cutouts here, and also a whole bunch of washers, like metal washers, which he then proceeded to arrange on pieces on a plate on a press, and then worked on the spot to create these images, and then they were printed, and they exist in a very small edition. There's only 3 of them in each of these prints. And these were done, as I say, in the course of one day in 2010, and that was made, the bright sky was made with a piece of mat board which had little chisels gouging out the surface. And Christine May has done a nice little essay where she's talked to Ms. Widmer about the process of how these things were made, and she was really struck by how he just worked on the fly, sort of as he to produce these things. And that was what I thought was the end of Tak's printmaking career. But one of the things that's extraordinary about Mr. Tanabe is he has been astonishingly supportive of museums, of artists, of a whole range of philanthropic things. And he and his wife, Nona Thorne, his second wife, Nona Thorne, were invited to an event at the West Vancouver Art Museum a few years ago. And it was a fundraiser for them. And someone had made prints of this to then sell to raise money. And Tak mentioned that he could do one of those. And so in 2023, he produced Cormorant Island with Peter Braun, who worked on that print. And it's again a completely unusual approach. It's a photogravure, and there is one other photogravure in this exhibition, and this is this little print over here. And normally what you get in a photogravure is what you see here. It's a black and white image. So essentially you take an image, a photographic image, you transfer it to a plate, and then you print it in black and white. And this kind of fuzzy sort of quality is very typical of the photogravure. Well, for Cormorant Island, which is based on a 2015 painting, they decided to make a photogravure in color. So there are 2 plates and 5 colors, and these things were printed by Peter Braun at New Leaf Editions in Vancouver. That being said, again, you have to keep the piece of paper wet while you're doing the process. And each print took at least 7 hours to print, because it's all hand inked and all this sort of stuff. And then you make a new one, you have to clean off the plate and then re-ink the whole thing. And it's interesting because there's a plate which is in the sky, and that's one color. And then there's the plate which is mostly all the landscape below, and there are 4 colors on that. So you can imagine having to take inking each part and then printing the things. And again, there's going to be a very small addition. But so after a huge gap of basically 13 years, he made another print. And that print will be in the show. So that means that you have the printmaking begins in 1948 when he was at Winnipeg as a young man, having no idea where his career would go. And 2023 when he is 96, about to turn 97, and he has had an extraordinary career, both as a painter and as a printmaker. And this is the first exhibition devoted to Tak Tanabe's prints.